All right, well, with the help of the bell and Stephanie, we are gathered again to head off on this day of sort of exploration and discovery about the ways that WikiLeaks and the press are finding their paths crossing over the issues of secrecy. I thought I'd begin just by reading briefly from a piece that David Carr did in the New York Times not too long ago, which was headlined, "WikiLeaks Taps Power of the Press." And let me just begin by reading from about the middle of his piece, where he talks about, he says, as it has become increasingly apparent that WikiLeaks was changing the way information is released and consumed, questions were raised about the value of traditional journalistic approaches. Then he goes on to quote Nick Lehman, Dean of the Columbia Journalism School. People from the digital world are always saying we don't need journalists at all because information is everywhere and there is no barrier to entry. But these documents, referring to WikiLeaks, provide a good answer to that question. Even though journalists didn't dig them out, there is a great deal of value in their efforts to explain and examine them. Who else would have had the energy or the resources to do what these news organizations have done? This is a theme we've heard underscored earlier, and I'm sure we'll hear it again from this panel. He went on to write, WikiLeaks may be willing to play ball with newspapers for now, but the organization does not share the same values or objectives. Mr. Assange and the site's supporters see transparency as the ultimate goal, objective, believing that sunshine and openness will deprive bad actors of the secrecy they require to be successful. Mainstream media, he wrote, may spend a lot of time trying to ferret information out of official hands, but they largely operate in the belief that the state is legitimate and entitled to at least some of its secrets. So let's see what this panel has to say about navigating the new rules and roles in the age of radical transparency. And to join us in that, we have currently with us three of our four speakers, with the fourth one promising to be on her way and join us soon. So let me go ahead and introduce all of them. You have bios in your packets, so I'm not going to go over necessarily the bio information, but what I did is I went and found words that they've written recently or that they've delivered in testimony to Congress on this topic, which I want to just toss out for all of us as a common ground to start with, and then invite them to illuminate us in other dimensions of these topics. Danielle Bryan is the Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight, otherwise known as POGO. In recent testimony she gave on Capitol Hill, she talked about the inattention by the State Department of whistleblowers who had come forward to talk about many of the problems with the embassy security being provided by a private contracting group called Armor Group in Kabul. Here is what she said. The issue here is not about obscene pictures and drunken men. It is about a contractor that has been entrusted with a profoundly important mission, protecting our diplomats and embassy in an increasingly violent war zone, and a federal agency that has utterly failed to oversee that contractor. What is truly obscene is that practically from day one, Armor Group North America knowingly underperformed in its mission in order to maximize its profits, endangering the diplomats and its own employees in the process, and the Department of State knew about it. She concluded by saying, I'd like to thank the more than 20 whistleblowers who came forward at great personal risk. The risk they took and continue to take is breathtaking. In return for their bravery, they have been called rats by some of their colleagues and woken up to posters on their doors and threats to their jobs and to their families, all while working 14-hour shifts and literally having bombs explode outside the gates of their compound. Let me introduce you now to Clint Hendler. He covers politics and government transparency for the Columbia Journalism Review. And as the editor of Neiman Reports, I want to welcome him in a special way as a colleague in sorts of our job to try to take a look at the press as best we can in terms of these dimensions. Recently, he wrote for the Columbia Journalism Review about an unsigned Washington Post editorial about WikiLeaks' release of war logs from Iraq. He began by saying it's a grumpy read. The editorial claims that there's nothing worth seeing in these documents and that the leak, quote, mainly demonstrates that the truth about Iraq has already been told. He went on to respond to the charge made in that editorial that the release was delaying the formation of the Iraqi government. He writes, but since when did journalists go about arguing that information shouldn't be exposed because it might complicate some political development by some party? And how exactly did this information, which supposedly everyone already knew, cause this political hiccup? The Post's editorial is just another example, if an especially incoherent one, of some element of the press shrugging off the documents. It's especially sad that it was voiced in our capital's paper. Maggie Mulvihill, who will be joining us soon, is a veteran investigative reporter, associate director and senior investigative producer of the New England Center for Investigative Reporting at our Boston University, just across the river. In Neiman Reports, she wrote for us about a book that was published by Jeffrey Stone, written by Jeffrey Stone, called Perilous Times: Free Speech in Wartime, from the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism. Writing about free speech in post-9/11 America, she said, during the past periods of national distress, Americans have witnessed that those who dared to question governmental leaders have been labeled unpatriotic or disloyal to their country, and this is now happening again. Regrettably, these have been times in our history, too. There have been times in our history, too, when ordinary Americans and the mainstream press have acquiesced too often in the government's restrictions and been party to the persecution, imprisonment, or deportation of dissenters, even if only by their silence. If we have learned nothing else from these earlier aggressive restrictions on the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment, we should have been taught by history's lessons that threats to our constitutional principles, the building blocks of our democracy, should never be tolerated. Walter Pincus is the final member who I will introduce, but he will also be the lead member who will take us on this beginning journey into sort of the United States, the role of the press, and the engagement with the WikiLeaks and secrets. Walter Pincus is a longtime intelligence and national security reporter for the Washington Post, where he continues to serve in that role. Again, writing in Neiman Reports, but this time about Ted Gupp's book on secrecy, he wrote the following. Gupp writes about his concern that, quote, today, America is a nation of secrets, an increasingly furtive land where closed doors outnumber open ones, and where it is no longer the right to know, but the need to know that is the measure against which access is determined. He goes on to write, as someone who has worked at reporting on government for some 50 years, I can't argue against aspiring and practicing journalists tacking that sentence up on their wall and remembering it as they go about their business. But there is, as Gupp alludes to, another way to think about this. Some secrets deserve to be kept, and even secrets uncovered might not merit being put in the public print, on television, or on the internet. Much as reporters ought to realize that everything an official says publicly might not deserve to be published, just discovering something that is being kept secret, even by government officials, doesn't mean it needs to be exposed. He concludes, Gupp concedes the point, saying honestly that, quote, where genuine national interest could be adversely affected, I have also remained silent. He, in fact, meaning Gupp, is trying to find the correct midpoint, saying, quote, secrecy and democracy are not irreconcilable, but the former, secrecy, often advances the latter. It often advances at the expense of the latter. I'm eager to hear from these four panel members whose vast experience today offers us the gift of their insights. Walter.
I guess if I've been around that long, I've turned into kind of an establishment figure, but I've learned to live with it. I used to be young and aggressive, and I'm in awe of these foreign journalists I hear year after year who are really risking their lives to do what I do at almost no risk at all, except being subpoenaed or having my own editorial board write nasty things about me, as they did 2 weeks ago. I want to talk a little bit about what we've heard about in terms of secrecy, but also I want to put it in the context of WikiLeaks. And I have these weird ideas. WikiLeaks, to me, is a really cleverly, or put it this way, I used WikiLeaks before he became famous, because he used to do it one at a time, which is the way I could handle it. I can't handle 250,000 cables dumped in one day. But he did it in a very clever way, and he did it in a way in which I think people ought to realize, and that is, for me, he's a source of information, of which there are hundreds. He is another source. But he's a source who's learned how to play the public relations game, as have most people in government. They've learned more about how to play us than we've learned how to deal with them. And so we've become a victim of public relations. I teach a class on oversight of government and the media. Stanford has a program in Washington. And I bang into my students that we are now in a PR society. PR by government, policies are put forward that sell, and they are sold to government. And what he did that was really clever, beyond putting one or two documents out without publicizing it, waiting for people to come to him, is he made a very clever deal with 5 or 6 newspapers, put them in competition with each other, set a deadline, and then put them in competition with the rest of us, so that he was guaranteed to get the kind of play he wanted. That's one part of it. But the fact that he made it available, and whether he did it by looking for things that were harmful or not harmful, I want to know the motives of my sources. If you look at the way I look at it, he is just another source. And so when I get information from sources, I care about why they're doing it. And most of them are not doing it because I'm a great reporter and all that. They have something to sell, and he has something to sell. But my responsibility is to sort of lay out a standard, which is, 1, is it true? 2, is it relevant? Is it in context? Is there a way to give it to people? And 3, is it something that I think, and I get into arguments with people in government all the time, that I think the public ought to know? And in our case, and at least in my case, and every journalist has a different rule. I don't care what your rule book says, where you work. Every one of us operates differently with sources. My rule is that, and the Post rule really, is we never write about government activity without going to the government to get their comment about it. When it's, in the case of the cables, I wrote 2 columns on the cable, but those are government documents per se, and I put them in the best context I could put them in. And basically, I didn't think they were classified anyway. Having worked in this field for years and To be honest, what's left, I don't know, I haven't seen my biography. My views of secrecy were formed, when I was in the Army in the Counterintelligence Corps at the end of the Korean War, if you want to date it. And then in my 20s and early 30s, I twice ran investigations for Senator Fulbright in the Foreign Relations Committee. And in those investigations, we dealt with classified information, had classified hearings, and I was the one who had to go through the process of declassifying them. And so classification, for me, for the last 40 years, has been a game of what the government person who classified it, because there is no standard, wanted to keep secret, and what I thought could be released. And so I sort of have that kind of feeling. So I lay those standards out. And I did it, and I think the WikiLeaks release left it up to journalists to decide what to print and their publications. And I think that's the right thing. But if you look at it the way I do, as another source, the thing I've learned over the years is there are enormous numbers of public sources of information, documents and court records and all sorts of things that I hate to say when we were younger we all used to read. And that became the source of a lot of materials. When I first started in journalism, there may have been 2 speeches a day in Washington and maybe 5 hearings. Now there are 40 hearings a day. There are people putting out releases all the time, all designed to get into the newspaper the next day. So we make choices every day. There is more news in Washington that's fit to print. My problem is, and WikiLeaks highlights it, how much of it has really been read. I'll give you 2 examples to pat myself on the back. I wrote a column the other day about George Bush's book because, in fact, he totally misused in a report in his book about that Hans Blix wrote before the war. He cherry-picked information out of one report in which the Iraqis had begun to cooperate but weren't, and left out the 2 subsequent reports that in effect said the Iraqis were cooperating and they were finding nothing, and they needed more time and they could determine whether or not, well, by using one part, not using the other, he did what his administration did with the intelligence before the war. But it's in the middle of the book and nobody talked about it. The other thing I'll talk about is open information. Is every day of the week there is a kind of WikiLeaks material put out in public that nobody reads. It used to be a publication called Commerce Business Daily. It's now called FBO Daily on the web. It is all the contracts the U.S. government puts out and all the awards it makes. And for the last 4 years, because I can't go to Iraq or Afghanistan and run around, I've sort of covered the war reading about contracts. And the contracts normally have been 6 months to a year ahead of whatever public statements have been put out. I mean, the idea that we were contracting out security guards because we didn't want to send more troops to Iraq was in these contracts. I wrote a couple of pieces recently about there's now $3.5 billion worth of construction contracts in Afghanistan, some of which are not going to be completed until 2012. Now we're beginning to get out in 2011, but in fact there is within the military the view that Afghanistan is our base in Central Asia for the future. And that's why Bagram keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But you see that in contracts, and it's open. I deal with intelligence people all the time, and open intelligence is now a big thing. The fact that there's a stamp on something doesn't make it true, and the fact there's no stamp on it doesn't make it non-newsworthy. So that one of the lessons I get out of WikiLeaks is one that I've always felt, which is there's a huge amount of material coming out about your government in Washington that people just don't get around to read and don't put in the paper because somebody's had a press conference or somebody's made a speech or something like that. And they're doing it because they want it in the paper. And we have given up as the media a lot of our ability to set our own agenda and leave it to people who are in government.
Well, to give a little sense of who POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, is, we were created nearly 30 years ago by whistleblowers inside the Pentagon who had been concerned about wasteful spending and falsified tests and wanted to be able to fix the problems but be able to keep their jobs. And so we have evolved over the years not to just be a voice for those whistleblowers, but to really apply investigative journalism techniques. But we sort of have the best of both worlds. We also then get to do the advocacy to fix the problems that we find. And so this whole WikiLeaks thing has sort of dominated our world because it's every part of what we care about is affected by the discourse now. And so I think it's important for us to, first of all, remember that everyone's talking about Assange and WikiLeaks, but we're forgetting the source, Bradley Manning, who's sitting in jail. And if there is any good to have come from the disclosures, it's amazing to me that he isn't more part of that conversation. And I think the first thing that people need to recognize is there are no safe channels for disclosure for even unclassified information. I mean, we're in pitched battle in Washington right now to get whistleblower protections for unclassified disclosures, let alone classified. Now that's really where it becomes extraordinarily difficult. And if Bradley Manning had come to POGO, we would have, and I don't know what happened between him and WikiLeaks, but I do know what we would have done in this case is to try to mentor him, to try to hone what are the specific things that you want to talk about, and let's try to work through some channels to see if there's things that we can accomplish internally first. And that's something that I know that would differentiate us from the traditional media, in that our goal isn't transparency in itself, it's to actually fix whatever the problem is. And I can give a couple of examples of how we've done that. In theory, then, the goal would be to fix the problem, keep the whistleblower out of jail, and actually protect, if there are any legitimate secrets, keep them secret. So I think one good example of how we accomplished that was when we had been working with the Department of Energy's weapons labs. And we had a number of insiders who were coming to us about lax security at Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, where they're housing plutonium and highly enriched uranium. As we were editing our report, 9/11 happened. And as you can remember, everything changed in Washington in terms of sensitivities to roadmaps for terrorists and all of that. So how do we handle this now? Because what we knew was not just classified, it was more highly classified than top secret. It was called a special access program. And the concept was that the plutonium and highly enriched uranium at these sites, which are now, Livermore has houses all around it. It is now a very residential area. That not only could a dirty bomb be created at these sites, but with surprising ease, an actual detonation could occur. So we went to the Congress, we went to the National Security Council. This was over a matter of weeks. We went to the Nuclear Command and Control staff and said, these are vulnerabilities that, because it's so secret, no one is working to deal with the vulnerability because no one's talking about it within the government. And after a while, we actually had people at the National Security Council, and this is during the Bush administration, saying, you guys need to just get out there and talk about it, because without external pressure, the bureaucracy is not going to deal with the problem. And that was sort of a considered decision that we made, and we sat down with our board and said, we're going out with something that really very likely, because we certainly have had cases where the government's come after us, this is a time where they may well do it. And they didn't, which is great. And we actually, as a result, were able to not only accomplish increased security standards addressing these concerns, but now this whole vulnerability is something that's commonly discussed by the Council on Foreign Relations and the GAO and the National Academies, as though it was always out there. So that's sort of one example of how we've been able to, what we would argue is sort of carefully handle something that is legitimately secret, but at some point it still has to come out to fix the problems that exist. We've had numerous cases where we've dealt with information that was not classified but was retroactively classified after we released it. So early on, we were dealing with Area 51, which at the time was a black facility that didn't exist according to the government. Now, of course, it's there are video games about it. But that was a battle where the Air Force actually tried to take all of our documents from our office because it was retroactively classified. There were numerous cases where that's happened. And so I love when you described it as a game, the classification, because it is a game. I mean, there was one example we had where we were dealing with dumbed-down tests at power plants, nuclear power plants. And we had written a letter and put it up on our website, and it was actually the Times that reported it. Matt, anyway, reports the story, and then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission writes us a letter saying that information is Homeland Security sensitive. That's not a classification. It's not legitimate, right? And if you don't take it down, we're going to prosecute you criminally and put you in jail. It's like, oh, come on. This is ridiculous. It's already been in the New York Times. So even if we take the letter down, what is that going to do? I mean, this is this idea now where the Air Force is saying that, that no one can look at the New York Times now. It's sort of silly in the way the government reacts to these things. And so to further this concept of a game, the negotiation was that I was able to go to a room up in Rockville at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with our attorney. They sort of sprinkled fairy dust on me and said, okay, you have a clearance now for like 2 hours. They'd done no background check, right? And discussed with me what was in one sentence in our letter that really bothered them, and we sort of could tinker. It had no impact in terms of what we wanted to disclose. And we worked on that one sentence, and then, okay, my clearance was gone, and it was just a game. It really was a game. So, so I think it's important not to take too seriously how the government decides what is or isn't classified. So what has changed for us from WikiLeaks? I would say not all that much. I think what has bothered me is the conversation about is WikiLeaks a journalism organization or not, as though the First Amendment only protects journalists. I think the First Amendment applies to me, and so it worries me that that's sort of the standard that's being focused on. But I do think that what's really important is that with the rights that are afforded with the First Amendment, there are also responsibilities, and so that's the way we approach these matters. So the problem that we're faced now in Washington is that the dialogue, at least, is entirely sort of barn door closing, reactionary, get Julian Assange, do we need to strengthen the First Amendment, how do we deal with the Espionage Act, and not dealing with the actual substantive things that we think need to be addressed, which are safe channels of disclosure, not just for unclassified, but ultimately, hopefully, classified information as well, more responsible classification and declassification processes, better secure. I mean, it really is absurd for private Manning to have access to all that information so easily, and being able to download it is silly. Instead, we're getting a bill now that is actually very similar to the Official Secrets Act that passed the Congress during the Clinton administration, and it was only because Clinton vetoed it that it isn't the law. We're seeing that there's an Ensign Lieberman-Brown bill that actually is redefining classified information, so it's not just stuff that's properly classified. And I would suggest that I believe that President Obama is not likely to veto it this time. So I think this is what we're going to be faced with rather than dealing with the substantive issues that we should be.
A frightening picture. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here with such distinguished guests and panelists, and really happy to be here. So I was asked to address the question of what good journalists are in an age of open data, open information. And I think the phrase, the idea that we live in an age of open data, I think it's more of a promise at this point than a reality. I think that's quite clear to see. It used to be that if you wanted government data of any kind, you had to do a couple of pretty analog things, or so I hear. You had to tromp down to City Hall and ask to see a ledger. Maybe you had to take a road trip to the state capitol or to a sympathetic university law library and see the records from the last session. You might have to call somebody up and ask for a copy of the data. You might have to file an Freedom of Information Act request. Of course, people do have to do all those things all the time still, and I've done all those things a time or two myself. But there is at least the potential with public servers on the internet, and that public data can be put on public servers, and virtually anyone can access them: journalists, citizens, bloggers, you and I, whatever you want to call yourself. And that's great, and it's very powerful. But just having access to the data doesn't mean that we can understand it. So where the barrier of a journalist, one of the key functions of a journalist used to be to break that barrier to entry, to go and obtain that data. And that's still a barrier that journalists are needed to breach in many situations. But where the data is available, the question then becomes, what other aspects of the traditional role of a journalist remain? What else is there left for journalists to contribute to the conversation? And I could argue that there's quite a lot. Good journalists don't get raw information. They must be expert in seeking context and in telling stories. And there is the world's best case study in how this happened went on over this summer with WikiLeaks. It's easy to forget that before this April, when they blasted into the public consciousness by releasing the video that WikiLeaks called the collateral murder video, that WikiLeaks had been doing this for a long time, 4 years, something like that, posting thousands of documents, many pages. And while what they did this summer was certainly a real change in the quantity, and to some extent a change in the type of information, it's not like the things they were leaking before weren't interesting or weren't vitally important and didn't expose issues of national and international consequence. They were. But they had quite a different model, which was more or less just to post it. So let's take a look at what they did with the video. The video, you'll remember, it's centered in the website that launched it. It's centered around this video that showed civilians, including 2 Reuters employees, being killed when a helicopter gunner apparently thought they were armed Iraqis or were aiding armed Iraqis and opened fire. WikiLeaks' packaging of the video had its detractors. There were those who suggested that WikiLeaks didn't point out that some people on the street that day were carrying weapons. There were some people who felt that the word murder went too far to describe what happened that day. But those disputes illustrate the fact that WikiLeaks had undertaken an editorial practice in releasing that video. They had decided what to label, what not to label. They had decided how to frame the video. A journalist who was then affiliated with the Icelandic state broadcaster, sort of their equivalent with the BBC, had traveled to Baghdad, interviewed some witnesses. They had compiled some relevant documents, including the Army's rules of engagement at the time, and placed them on their website. This was a lot of work. If any of you read Rafi Kachadorian's excellent New Yorker profile of Julian Assange, it sort of chronicles this time when Julian and a band of aides, most of them Icelanders who were not professional journalists, but you could, he described scenes that would be familiar to any journalist. Sometimes tense editorial meetings, a lot of hard work, far too little sleep. So contrast that with what they could have done, and to what, to a large extent, they had done up to that point. Just upload the video file. Maybe not even put it on YouTube. Just upload the video file and let people download it. Now, this video got a lot of attention, of course, because it was so graphic, and I mean that in both sense of the words. It was a visual depiction. It could be on television, and it was also very disturbing. But I think it also at least plants the seeds of a future strategy, which is that these raw documents have a far greater impact when they are contextualized in other reporting that illuminates the events that they describe and the trends that they describe. And I think in that you can see the future of the release system that, with some modifications, was launched with the release of about 90,000 Afghanistan logs this spring, and then continued through the Iraq logs, and now most recently the cables, which was that WikiLeaks gave teams of professional journalists from really some of the world's blue-chip media organizations, the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, later on El País and Le Monde, and gave them a chance to go through them ahead of time, to comb through them, to make sense of it, to conduct narratives around it. And the results were quite different. They were stories that we could all understand. They were stories that we could all grasp were important and were interesting. C.J. Chivers of the Times, who has an Ernie Pyle-like eye for the experience of the common soldier, reconstructed a bloody firefight scene from the front lines in Afghanistan that read like a screenplay. The Guardian produced an interactive map that took you through every IED explosion in Afghanistan and showed you where they were happening more often than others. Other papers, found interesting stories in the documents that if the documents had simply been posted, maybe would never have been uncovered in quite the same way. The system that was birthed here allowed the outlets near exclusives. And as Walter alluded to, I think that is sort of important. I mean, if you're going to spend this much time on anything, it's nice to know that you're going to that your work is going to have an impact, that you'll get some credit for it, and that your work will be taken seriously. But it also ensured, in a way that Julian Assange had really not had success in the past, that these documents were taken seriously and combed through with the care that they deserved. Assange recently, and actually he knew this at the time, I spoke with a Guardian reporter and editor who told me that Assange basically said this when he was working in the Guardian newsrooms with the original 3 news organizations, and that he realized that without somebody taking the care on these documents, especially now that they were getting into these multi-tens of thousand troves, that they just weren't going to get the impact they wanted. So to come back to much more conventional data disclosures, the things of security filings, parking tickets, demographic data, what are the lessons that WikiLeaks has? Well, the exclusivity issue becomes a little more complicated. If you file a FOIL request, you have a decent idea of knowing that you'll probably be the first news organization to get a look at those documents, maybe exclusively. Although government entities have been known to release these things simultaneously to multiple reporters to sort of take away any benefit that they get from that sort of exclusivity. But you have a reasonable chance. But in the reams of information that are published every day by our governments, from Washington to the smallest towns, it does again speak that just because that information is now technically possible and is more often being put online, it still says that there is a place where finding a story in the data remains essential. Journalists and reporters have skills that are valuable to find those stories and the time and resources to get that done. And at heart, it shows that getting data is usually only the first step towards establishing public understanding. So, thank you.
Maggie, welcome. Delighted to have you. I actually have already introduced you in absentia. So you have your full time to share with us your thoughts.
Thank you. I was out fighting the good fight. You'll be glad to know I just came from our quarterly board member meeting of the New England First Amendment Coalition, which is a group of publishers and editors from all the New England states who got together a couple of years ago to try to fight for open government here in New England. So I'm really glad to be here. I'm really privileged to be included in this group, and I really appreciate seeing everybody. I was watching the news this morning, and I heard somebody refer to Julian Assange as devoting his life's work to fighting government secrecy. And I was thinking, I'm spending my entire day with people who are doing that at one level or the other. Maybe certainly not on that scale, but anyway, I'm really glad to be here. I was recently talking to a friend of mine who's applying for a Nieman Fellowship, and she was asking me how it was that I chose increased government secrecy as my plan of study back in 2004 when I applied. And at the time, I was an investigative reporter for the Boston Herald, and we were having just an increasingly hard time getting access to the most mundane government records. The effects of 9/11 had really settled in by 2004, and security concerns were cited, frequently by even the most lowly bureaucrat at Boston City Hall as a creative reason to deny access. Also at that time, I remember thinking, and then I wrote a paper about it later when I was here at the Nieman Foundation, the lack of public outrage about news organizations' inability to go to photograph the caskets that were coming back from Iraq. And I remember thinking, if the public isn't furious about that, I mean, we're paying for this war, it's our kids who are dying, how is that going to trickle down to embolden the local official to deny access? And we here in Boston were having trouble getting records. I mean, state officials would fail to digitize records, so they could justify charging thousands of dollars to give us paper records. You'd be facing months of delays to appeal a denial. So it was getting harder and harder to have access. And that certainly was true at the national stage, on the national media stage, and I'm sure it still is in a lot of ways, but I worked on the local plane. I felt that at the local level, government transparency is just as critical as any agency that's in a power center like Washington or New York. So it was a difficult time, and that is why I chose my area of study as government secrecy. My readers at the Herald, which has since disbanded its investigative team, unfortunately, were truck drivers in Boston and nurses and inner city school workers and union officials. And I always felt, and I still feel, that those people deserve as excellent a piece of public service journalism as anybody reading the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or any other citizen or taxpayer. So parallel to increased government secrecy on every level was deep cuts in local newsrooms, particularly with watchdog journalism or investigative units. That kind of reporting absolutely needs to happen at the local level, and I'm going to give you some kind of comical examples of recent history in Massachusetts. They're actually not comical, but I guess as a reporter, we're a little cynical. In the last couple of years here in Massachusetts, we have had our last 3 speakers of the House of Representatives be indicted for criminal violations. A state senator, a prominent state senator, is facing sentencing for bribery, in which she was videotaped by the FBI here stuffing cash down her bra. A Boston City councilor was recently convicted of corruption charges. The mayor's chief of staff, who holds a really powerful position in Boston, was put on a paid leave for deleting hundreds of emails after he got a FOIA request from his City Hall computer. We had a high-level court clerk who was stealing coins from the courthouse copier machine in Cambridge. He's in jail. We had a pretty powerful FBI agent here, John Connolly, mixed up in a mob witness situation, which I can't explain to you. It's too detailed with Whitey Bulger, but he's been convicted of murder in a case relating to his work. A state prosecutor on the Cape is under federal corruption investigation. So that's just Massachusetts, and that's just that's recent history. And I think that illustrates the point that deep government accountability reporting at the local level is really important. We've got to do it. It's pretty clear that when our leaders are up to no good, they need to know that we're watching. And it scares me, frankly, that maybe we haven't been watching as aggressively as we should have been. So that's the problem. There's been cuts in local watchdog reporting, increased government secrecy, and what do we do about it? So some of us defiant local journalists like me and my colleague Joe Bergantino, we set out a few years ago when we were working for the CBS affiliate here to create what is now the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, of which Bob, I'm very honored, is on our board, and Barry Sussman is going to be joining our Journalism Advisory Board. And what we aimed to do here, because we knew it needed to be done, was create something akin to the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, which we really, really admire. We've always admired, and we work closely with them now on some stuff. We think they do government accountability, like a lot of other big players, really well, and we knew, given the landscape here, that we needed something like that here. So we set out to create that, and what we wanted to address and what we recognized was that local watchdog reporting had to continue, and I think even deeper than that, we had to train the younger reporters how to really dig in on a micro level and to understand which I'm fearful that they don't, having worked with them for the last couple of years, that government works for them and it's not the other way around. So the New England Center for Investigative Reporting is funded by the Knight Foundation, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we created it. But I think Joe and I really feel truly that the gap is not on the national stage. We'll always have the big guys. Thank God, the New York Times and ABC News doing the big important stories that we need. I mean, one example is the story on the military generals a couple of years ago that were, supposedly neutral commentators on the war. But what about the county sheriff who's mistreating prisoners, or the local school board official who's not honoring what he's supposed to be doing in terms of keeping the school running properly, or the local politician who's taking campaign money to influence his vote? I call it low-to-the-ground reporting, and I really believe that kind of stuff has to continue. Truly impactful reporting does not occur, and this is the way I think about it, I call it close-to-the-bone reporting. You get really, really close up to granular information that directly impacts people. I try to think when I'm working on a story about parents sitting at a kitchen table and how is it really, what is the human drama? How is it really affecting them? So anyway, that's the backdrop to what Joe and I were thinking about doing. So how we made this happen is we luckily were funded by the Knight Foundation, which I already mentioned. And at the time that we were thinking of creating this, we were lucky enough to have a man come to Boston, Tom Fiedler, who's a former editor at the Miami Herald, who's going to be the new dean at the Boston University College of Communication. And he believes deeply in watchdog journalism. So we chose to base our center there at BU. The Knight Foundation funds us, as they're doing with a lot of other new organizations. BU gives us money for our part of our salaries. We have private donors, all of whom we disclose. We have money from Ethics and Excellence. And since we opened our doors in January of 2009, a couple of things have happened. We've trained over 30 students who are learning investigative reporting techniques, really what we think of basics, but downloading government data, analyzing government data, pulling courthouse records, doing audio interviews. We supervise them. They work with us on our stories. We've had a couple of Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters come to us when we opened our doors, really encouraged and heartened that something was happening here. One of them was Rochelle Sharp, who won a Pulitzer at the Wall Street Journal. And she's a working mom here in Boston, and she wanted to do a story on whether or not the Cambridge, Massachusetts police really were arresting more blacks than whites for disorderly conduct after Henry Gates got arrested. And so we got her funding to do that, and it turns out that they arrest more whites than blacks for that very discretionary charge. That was a story that got picked up nationally. Doug Struck, who's a former Associated Press foreign correspondent, had wanted to do a story on fraud in the global carbon offset, and we got him a $35,000 grant to do that story, which ran in the Christian Science Monitor. We've also trained bloggers and citizen activists who are really interested in learning how to do basic government reporting, really people working who don't know even how to find out how to download campaign finance records. We had a training in October that was really well attended at BU. We're doing one in January at the City University of New York. We produce powerful content, powerful local content, multimedia content, content that's been published in Spanish. And we have moved the needle a little bit with our stories, on a smaller scale, but a story that we did last year about a state official who was mismanaging a really critical state agency. She resigned after that story. A story we did on stimulus contractors that were not disclosing to the state of Massachusetts as they should have. Pollution and labor violations led to a change in policy. a really important story we did about a girl who got raped at the University of Massachusetts, and her rapist was allowed to remain in the dorm without any punishment from the school, led to the creation of a commission. I could tell you afterwards, I'm getting the wrap-up sign here to finish, but we've tried to inculcate in our students and also to give hope to journalists out there that, you know, the notion that this kind of reporting has to continue on every level, whether it's the Cape Cod Times, Town Hall, to the Defense Department and WikiLeaks. And I think we're having some influence doing that. One of our students got a really competitive internship at ProPublica. They've gone on to work at the AP, local papers. And the one final thing that I want to say is we also were a founding member of a group that's really taking beautiful shape now, the Investigative News Network, which is a group of now 52 local and some national nonprofit news organizations. Florence is one of the members. Reporters all over the country have gone out and been, you know, emboldened to start their own centers, and we're all working together on stories. We did this campus sexual assault story last year or earlier this year. So we're having a powerful, but small, I admit, impact on local journalism in New England. And I'm really proud of what we've done. We didn't just sit in our newsrooms and complain about how the world was changing. We went out and did something about it. And I'm really happy to tell you about what we're doing here in Boston. So thank you.
Thank you all. I mean, it's a whole cornucopia of thoughts that are up here in insights. So I'll be very interested to hear where the questions come from and how you all synthesize what you've heard and bring to the table some discussions to kind of prompt us in similar directions or perhaps even in different ones. So let's begin. You had your hand up first. Introduce yourself, please, and come right ahead.
Jeff Young. I work for a public radio program called Living on Earth. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how important the motivation of sources, especially leakers as sources, what does it matter what their motivation is? Because I can think to a few examples where I strongly suspect people leaking information were doing so out of very petty, base motives, covering their behind, seeking revenge, whatever it might be, but the information was valid and clearly in the public interest. And I think if we expect leakers have to be saintly, and then the moment they are found to have a parking ticket violation or something, it's used against them. I think it's kind of a classic trap for whistleblowers that they have to do Mother Teresa or something. Your thoughts?
Great. Jeff, let's start with Walter, since he's the one who raised this, and I see Danielle wants a part of this too. So, Walter?
Well, I think it's important to find out, if you can, what the person's, the reason they're doing it. Most people that I deal with, are people this always gets people upset. I get most of the classified information that I write about from people I've known a long time. And it's part of the conversation. If you're talking to people and don't have a document, you really don't know if it's classified or not. So there's that thing. I am not somebody that gets a lot of material over the transom. And I hate to say it, most of the people who call me and want, right off the bat, protection, have information that's wrong. So that's honestly been my experience. I know people who, people do it for all sorts of reasons. You want to know what the reason is, but the really important thing is the information accurate? And is it newsworthy? And if it is, you've got to put it in context. So the motivation, take your pick, but it's our job to get at what's truthful and newsworthy and not try to settle things. I mean, the great irony of the Post, everybody was angry. I have the most confidential sources in the paper. I mean, I use that nonsense all the time. And so the Post did a survey of where the most unidentified sources came from his sports department.
Danielle, you had something to say on this.
I love the question because from our perspective, you're exactly right that a whistleblower doesn't need to be pure in why they're talking about what they're talking about. Really is about the sort of the facts that they're trying to disclose. And that question, I think, is almost always asked of the whistleblower, but almost never asked of the executive branch official who is leaking the information. What is their motivation? Why are they leaking the classified information? And it's sort of, I think, very unevenly applied. We also do training for congressional staff on how to do oversight, and I think that the motivation is really important. If you're thinking about someone as a witness at a hearing, you want to know that because the people are going to use whatever dirt they can find on the person to sort of discredit them as a source or as a witness. But at the end of the day, it really is about sort of the information that's what matters.
Okay. Anyone on this side of the room? I'm kind of going to move around. Go ahead again.
Oh, okay. I'm Mabel Chan,
Yep.
visiting scholar with the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. This is a question for Walter. I appreciate the way you laid out the principles for deciding what is newsworthy or fit to print. You mentioned whether it's true, whether it's relevant, and whether it's something the public ought to know. Can you recall one or two examples where it passed the first two, is true, is relevant, the public ought not to know? And how did you decide that?
It happens, not a lot, but it does come up. I have a rule, and again, the papers accepted it. There were stories in the past about covert operations or covert personnel at the agency, and there was a very famous lawsuit in which a woman filed and said she had been overlooked for promotion and things had happened to her. And she filed under Jane Doe. And I got the lawsuit and I found out who it was. But I didn't print her name because there's a rule about that. I was involved in the Valerie Plame case and was told I wrote the first long story. Nick Crystal had the first story about the ambassador who decided that they hadn't found, that they weren't buying uranium from Niger. And it took me 3 weeks to find out who he was. And then I interviewed him on background because he didn't want to come forward, and wrote a long story about how he came to the conclusion he came to. And then when Joe did his op-ed piece in the Times, we did an interview with him, which was put in the back of the paper, I must say. So the Times got all the credit, never wrote about the story. But I was then called by, I can say it publicly, Ari Fleischer, as one of the reporters who was told about Valerie Plame, and Fleischer said, "Why do you keep writing about him? Don't you know his wife works for the agency?" And it was, as I put it in the paper, it was a junket. But when Novak came out, I never wrote about it because, and this is part of my idiot life, I had just gotten a law degree in 2001 and knew that they hadn't violated the law. In other words, Ari Fleischer's goal was not to harm the United States or hurt or help an enemy. And that's what that law about disclosing requires. It has to have that intent. So I didn't write about it until there was a federal investigation of who it was, and then we figured out a way to write about it. But the Post has a whole series of Woodward cases and my cases where the government has come in as high as the president to say this really will hurt national security. So we make a judgment. So we decide, the government doesn't like it, but they get their say, and then we've done it long enough. You can make a judgment about what's going to hurt, what's not going to hurt.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm John Mulhannon from Science. Just curious about the journalistic status of WikiLeaks, and more generally, who counts as journalism, why it matters. So Danielle, you mentioned who cares, we all have First Amendment, but then you really made the point that it made a huge difference and it matters whether or not this information is being treated journalistically or just dumped vaguely. I'm just, for future reference, what do you get when you're considered a journalist?
Well, if you don't mind.
No, you go ahead. I'll say something.
Yeah, so I think it matters a great deal whether you handle something journalistically from a sense of whether or not it has great impact. That's most what I was speaking about. Legally is an entirely different question. And I find it very hard to draw, and I'm not sure I want to draw a line between what WikiLeaks does and what the New York Times has been doing for 30 or 40 years. I think one of the most important news stories of the last several years was based around a far more classified diplomatic cable from Afghanistan written by Ambassador Eikenberry, where he laid out why he thought basically Obama's Iraq strategy wasn't going to work. Well, the Times got a hold of it. The Times redacted some small parts of it, published it, wrote it up. It shook the conversation about what the president's plan in Afghanistan was enormously. Now that's one cable. It's not 250,000, but it's pretty much legally the same thing. And I think it's going to be very problematic for any prosecution that focuses solely on WikiLeaks' role as a republisher of classified information or a disseminator of classified information, that it won't also trap many vital functions performed by our newspapers and other watchdog journalism organizations. So I hope that answers some of your questions.
Danielle, does that echo yours, or do you have something
I just
to
want
add?
to clarify, when I said who cares, it really was a case of, under the law, what is the distinction? I do think it really matters a lot that there is sort of thought and responsibility placed on sort of the dissemination of information. But I do think in the current the opportunities for technology that exists now, the distinction between the source and the disseminator is starting to blur from my perspective. I mean, pretty soon Bradley Manning or future Bradley Mannings will just put it up themselves, and now what do you have? So
yeah, that's true. I mean, a source could be their own disseminator, but the legal distinction remains, which is that Bradley Manning, by being a government employee, had an official obligation to keep those secrets.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is quite a different role than that of the journalist.
Okay, let's go over to this side.
Yes, I'm hearing a lot of...
Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry. Jonathan Stray from the Associated Press. I'm hearing a lot of discussion of national security, national interest. Is a news organization based in the United States, by definition, there to serve the interests of America?
Who would like to take that on? Walter, why don't we start with you?
To be glib, our responsibility is to serve our readers. And now we have readers all over the world, but we're essentially not a national paper. The Grahams made a decision. It's a local paper in whose realm is national news because we're in Washington. And so I think our survival, I hate to say it, it hurts my ego, depends much more on our local reporting than it does on what I do. But we're allowed in the national staff and our foreign staff to cover foreign news. But we don't cover it the way foreign people would like it covered or at any of the length because we're really focused on our readers.
Let me just add a wrinkle to that if I can, and then maybe some of the rest of you. I think that it was Jay Rosen who first described WikiLeaks as the first stateless news organization, which I think may be what you're getting at with your question, that here we have the development of what is arguably the first stateless news organization. If indeed you buy the fact that it's a news organization, I'm just using the term that was applied to it. Is that what you're getting at, that we have this now compared to news organizations that have had a geographic location and thus some engagement with the place in which they're geographically located? Or
I'm just wondering, invocations of national security and national interest sound very strange when you're outside of the U.S. That's sort of what I'm getting at. Maybe there is an international press. Maybe that concept does or could exist.
Okay. Any of you want to comment back, or should we go on to another question?
It's an interesting abstract question, but our interest, when we talk about our national interest, we're talking about a paper that's in this country. If you had ask the International Herald Tribune. But the national interest we're talking about is the U.S. government's national interest. And I don't know how you fit that into your world scheme as to whether there's a neutral way. Every country has its own interest.
But are you making the distinction between the government's interest and the nation's interest? I think the questioner, right? You're sort of suggesting that the government's national interest isn't necessarily the people's national interest,
People
right?
interpreted globally, yes.
Right.
Right. Well, I think there's a third category. It's maybe not necessarily the American people's interest, but it's quite possibly the interest of 5.75 other billion people.
Exactly.
It's a very hard question to know exactly because it gets to varying definitions of interest. I think you often see newspapers publish information that is not in the government's interest. We see that all the time. Then, if you want to take it a step beyond that into not in the national interest, you have to get into some very thorny questions about what national interest is. And then, as I said, there's this third level, the global one that you're raising. Then you, I think you get forced to make some very tough decisions at that point. So, sorry, that's kind of a dodge.
Yeah, Paul Knox from Ryerson University in Toronto and a Neiman alumnus. I'm going to press on this a little bit because I haven't really heard a good answer yet. I think I heard Walter say that start by talking about identifying covert operatives, which is one issue, and then talk about getting calls from the president about national security. Those, to me, are two different things. The one's pretty much a fairly easy call. You don't, get individuals killed if you can help it. The other one is, the other one is like the New York Times and the Bay of Pigs. If we had to publish what we knew, this disaster might not have happened. And there was a lot, of course, of hindsight about that. So if I could, and I'd also like, for example, to hear if Maggie thinks that there really are any cases in which the type of information that she deals with on a local level is information that the public doesn't need to or ought not to know.
Let's start with the first one on national security and how the press responds to these various pressures on that topic. Walter, you want to lead us off again?
Well, we go both ways. We've published things that they didn't want published. I always hate telling war stories because to be a journalist, you've got a huge head and you sit and everybody thinks you know what you're talking about. And you just know what people tell you. I once published, I did a story about spies. And I wrote a story about how we discovered Aldrich Ames. And the next day, the CIA director came in and talked to our editor and said, "You published it, but don't publish it again." And so we haven't.
Maggie, you want to take on the local question?
Well, I'm just thinking in covering the stimulus, the wish list that the governor sent down to Washington, his wish list of what we need to get funded for stimulus. A lot of that, in fact, I don't think we ever got that list. Certain things had to do with building plans or roadway information you can be very creative with the way that you define security and what shouldn't be released, and that was starting to happen all the way back in 2004 when it came onto my radar screen, and I was trying to think what story I was working on, and I do think it was some sort of story, a development story, in which I wanted some building plans in the city of Boston, and the argument was made that I couldn't have them because they shouldn't be released to the public.
Paul, recently Marcus Broccoli, of course, who's the editor and of the Washington Post and was a classmate of mine as a Neiman Fellow, came up and addressed a Shorenstein dinner, the Richard Salant lecture. And one of the things he made a point of saying is that one of the luxuries in some ways that we have in this country as being a press grounded here under the constitutional freedoms and under the court cases that have resolved some of these issues is that newspapers, journalists do not feel that they shouldn't necessarily go to the government and at least ask questions about national security, because in the end they have the right that's been established to print what they choose to print. In other words, they don't leave those meetings fearing that the government is going to be able to tell them what they can't print. They will just pass on to them information from their perspective about why they would make the judgment one way or the other on that point. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
A lot of people feel, I think it's fair to say, and I think this is what's maybe reflected in some of these questions, a lot of people feel that, that may be what the elite media do, but there's a creeping willingness on the part of most news media to make those decisions themselves and lean much more toward the assumption that there's, that you don't publish a building plan, like Maggie said, because, well, terrorists might get hold of it or whatever. And I guess what I'm wondering is if anybody feels that, there's a need for a little bit more precision here. So what principles are we operating under? And, is it always just a case-by-case basis? Or, some people in the journalism ethics field are starting to write about, use the word patriotism and say, is there a conflict between journalistic values and patriotic values? Does patriotism have any place in journalism at all? And if it does, what does it mean on a global scale, as people have been alluding to, where your readers are all over the place? Well, what does that mean? I have my own views about that.
Yeah.
But I'm just
well, let's hear some views up here. Everyone's shaking their head or putting their hand up, so I think there's anticipation that they have something to say to this. So,
well, I would say, once you start talking about patriotism and making decisions based on that, well, Bob Giles might be one kind of a patriot, and I might be another kind of a patriot. That's dangerous ground to get in. It really, I think, is just much simpler. And Walter said it. Your responsibility is the truth, and it's to the readers or to the viewers. I
heard him say that. Then I also heard him say we go both ways. So.
Walter, have your say.
No, you've come to the heart of what makes this country great, which is it's free. It's not the First Amendment. It's free speech. Mm-hmm. And people can get up and do anything they want. And this whole idea that somehow somebody's going to find some way to pass a law to block it, I think, if you ask me, there are a lot of people in the blogosphere, whatever that is, who probably are irresponsible as hell. But, that's an underlying foundation of this country. And you've got to live with it. And the dangers are that somebody oversteps the bounds and somebody's going to pass a law that a couple of us will have to break. Because, it's this old argument going to law school.
Danielle.
Bad cases make bad law.
Bad cases, right. Danielle.
I think that it's really important to make this distinction between what the government wants and what's best for the national interest. And I don't think there's anything that nothing that Pogo's ever worked on that the government writ large wanted us to come out with. So that, but that doesn't mean there weren't individuals who were, supportive of what we were trying to do. So I have an example of something we didn't come out with for this reason. We had a bunch of baggage screeners that came to us from airports around the country about 5 years ago and said that there was sort of massive problems with the bomb detection equipment. There were so many false positives that they were just turning them all off. Oh. That's pretty, right? It's kind of a big deal. And so we evaluated. We went into the agencies that were actually working on this, and we found out that it was true. So there's no question about fact, or this was true. But the problem was there was no technology yet to accommodate what they were trying to do. So this wasn't the case. At first I thought, oh, maybe there was sort of a member of Congress who had required us to buy a certain technology because it was in his district and there was a better technology. There was none of that. There wasn't anything out there yet that was actually able to accommodate at the speed they were trying to accomplish with. And so we thought, all right, so we'll scare everyone. It would certainly make the front page of USA Today, right? But there wasn't a way to fix the problem at the time. Since then, they have been able to catch up with the technology, and we made a decision that it would sort of be irresponsible to go out there and scare everyone when there was nothing that they could be doing about it. So that was an example where we decided that it was in the public interest not to talk about it.
Clint.
So not to second-guess Danielle's call there, which I've never heard this incident before, but the pro-transparency argument there would be that more attention on that would make people work faster. And again, not to second-guess the call, but that's the kind of decision you have to weigh. But to go back to your question about, and your question also about this global thing, I thought of a very good case example here, which was actually Dana Priest from the Washington Post wrote this article about the so-called black sites, mostly in Eastern Europe, where we were detaining people in the war on terror. And I believe the government asked the Post to withhold the names of the particular countries because the government was arguing that these countries were effectively innocent bystanders, that that it would be unfair for these countries to bear the brunt of possible terrorist attacks for having become a quiet U.S. ally in this way. And I think the Post fought that line. But I always thought, well, hold on a second. What if I were a citizen of one of these Eastern European countries and was outraged that my government was doing this behind my back? I mean, a lot of the other countries where the governments were collaborating in some way with U.S. efforts in this regard did face massive protests and investigations. So I think that's a very interesting question about whose public was being served then.
I think, I just want to also add that I think through WikiLeaks and some of the cables that we've seen recently, we've seen cables back and forth that provide sort of deals to various countries for, in fact, doing this. So, in fact, they may not have been such innocent bystanders in terms of this whole thing. Florence, you've asked some questions. Tom, has anyone new? Philippa.
Yeah, it struck me that we're all talking about WikiLeaks, and this time next year it could be a footnote. There could be many more organisations out there doing the same thing. And I just want to know whether you feel this is exhilarating or terrifying or both. Any reflections?
Well, anyone exhilarated? Anyone terrified? Or some adjective in the middle?
I think an important thing to point out is that WikiLeaks isn't WikiLeaks, right? I mean, when they first started, when they came to us when they were starting 4 years ago or whatever, they were very proud of having no filters. That was their whole point, and that worried us a lot at the time. But, we didn't realize how big that was going to become a problem. But even in the last 6 months, they have transformed themselves so much that I think it's important to recognize that they've evolved to recognize sort of the impact of having no filters at all.
What I like about WikiLeaks is that it's got young people talking on college campuses. Like the issue of freedom of information and government transparency is, all my students are talking about WikiLeaks, and I think that's a good thing because, no matter what happens, these kids, as I call them, they have to understand that government transparency is critical on every level. And I know at BU they're all talking about it, and that I think it's serving its public purpose in that way for sure.
Okay. I just want to correct one record. Doug Struck, who you mentioned earlier, you affiliated him with the AP. He actually was a forward correspondent with the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post, I believe.
I said the Post.
He was a Neiman Fellow.
Oh,
so
sorry. He was.
That's all right. Just want to correct the record on that. Tom?
Tom Blinkhorn, Neiman alum. I have a question for Maggie. These public investigative initiatives like yours and Paul Steiger's ProPublica and the other one that you mentioned, the News Network, what is the financial underpinning for these? Do you see that they are likely to be sustained? Is there enough money in this difficult economy to keep them going? Do you find that you're spending most of your time as a fundraiser rather than doing what you originally intended to do? Can you say something about the financing of this?
Yeah. Well, we were tasked specifically by Knight